The cold winter weather is fast approaching in the Northern Hemisphere. Countries in Europe are scrambling for energy supply. Since the war in Ukraine started, the issue of energy has been a problem in the region. On the agenda now, we are joined by SABC News correspondent Trent Murray to talk to us about the energy situation in Europe. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us, and of course joining us from Berlin. First of all, why did Cabinet take this decision? Now, speaking about the German Cabinet taking this decision to mothball this coal-fired plant and re-fire it up.
Yeah, well, good morning to you. That's right. I mean, what we have witnessed here in Germany over the past 18 months really is just this mad scramble to try and find alternative energy supplies. It was just over a year ago that the last of the Russian gas which supplied Germany, I should say, dried up, coming down via that Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And what we have seen since then is effectively the German government go out to the world desperately trying to find alternative supplies. Let me give you a bit of context, if I could. Before the war in Ukraine began, about 55% of Germany's gas came from Russia. Today, that number is 0%. Countries like Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands stepping in, but also liquid natural gas coming in via ships from the US, Qatar and Nigeria. But in order to do that, new infrastructure has had to be built. It's been an enormous effort by the German government in order to make that happen. But as you said, it is those coal-fired power plants which have also proved very controversial. Germany's desperately trying to get its emissions down, but the war in Ukraine has just completely thrown out their plans, and instead what they've had to do is keep those coal-fired powered plants running in order to quite literally keep the lights on. That has upset green campaigners, as you might imagine. But what the German government is saying, look, we just don't have any choice here. If we don't keep those plants running, we're going to have real problems in the grid. And there's genuine concern that the country could struggle to keep its lights on without that coal power.
Yeah, and we saw that decision also, a similar decision was taken last year as well, and Germany arguing at the time as well that they are still committed to renewable energy. And I think that the date that they set themselves is to ensure that they have about 80% renewable energy, I think by the year 2030, if I'm not mistaken. They've increased that number. Where does Germany stand right now, and is that commitment to renewable energy still intact?
Well, the government says it is on track and that they're going to hit it, but you can understand that why there may be a bit of hesitation from certain groups over whether that will happen. And that is because the country is actually seeing its emissions go up right now at a time they should be going down. And again, it's those coal-fired power plants which are really driving all of this. The country really relies on gas in order to keep their houses warm during the winter. Instead, electricity now being used in many places, which has to come from coal-fired power plants. It's also interesting, the definition of renewable energy. And the reason I say that is because the likes of the French and the northern Scandinavian countries, they consider nuclear energy to be a renewable, clean energy source. But the Germans take a very different view. The issue of nuclear energy is a red-hot political topic here. Many people have campaigned for decades to shut down the nuclear power plants. The last of them shut down at the beginning of this year, and that really left a lot of experts scratching their heads, because they're saying, why would you shut down nuclear power plants that are running effectively, whose maintenance is well in line, at a time when you're desperate for energy? But the centre-left party here has long rallied against nuclear energy. They are in power right now under Olaf Scholz, so they stuck to that original ambition. But the question is whether Germans are now having to pay more for their electricity because of that political decision to shut down those remaining 3 nuclear power plants.
Yeah, and speaking about the increase in electricity prices, we saw what happened last year as well, and how that also had an impact in the cost of living. Do we know from a broader perspective, looking at the other European countries, how they're trying to counter the increase in the cost of electricity, but also making sure that they have enough energy supply during the cold winter?
Well, this is a very difficult balancing act in many ways for governments, not just here, but across Europe, because they do have in many places, including here, effectively government grants and tax breaks in order to try and help households with rising energy prices. But the trouble with it is what the European Central Bank is saying, which manages all of the finances, is that the more of that money that is handed out, the more that is going to drive up inflation, which is a big issue right now. We are seeing the cost of electricity and groceries still way above what they should be because of inflation numbers. The latest data shows that in August, which is the latest that we have, electricity prices were up about 16%. And the big worry is that if China continues to bounce back, of course, such a major economy economically, that's going to drive up demand for gas from China. So that will then push up the prices at a wholesale level and again really make it difficult for governments to try and shield their citizens from those rising prices. So look, it's very challenging, and I think it goes to the broader issue of how this war in Ukraine is having a big ripple-on effect across Europe, really hurting people at a household level. And I think for that reason, you are starting to see in the polls perhaps people just starting to back off a little bit over their levels of support for Ukraine because they are really feeling it at their hip pocket now, the cost of that war, again, through inflation, electricity prices, grocery prices, and of course just the general political uncertainty around the conflict.
Yeah, and a final one, of course, the conflict ongoing, the impasse in the United States as well around aid for Ukraine, and the call being made by President Zelensky requesting for more military support. Has there been any movement from the EU also considering that proposal of the 500 million euros?
Well, I think what is known here in Europe is that the US really remains the linchpin of the military support, certainly for Ukraine right now. And as we see some of those noises coming out of America, particularly from the parts of the Republican Party, that if they're able to take the White House next year, they want to really pull back on that aid. Europe knows that if that happens, it's going to have to step up. But the question is whether it's got the capability to do that. I mean, certainly countries like Germany have underinvested in defence in recent years. I think we can objectively say that. There is pretty wide consensus within the political establishment here that more needs to be done on defence. And so if America starts to pull back, that will make it very challenging for Berlin, for Paris, for London to try and pick up the slack. So look, I think for every month that this war goes on, those questions will continue to grow around whether that support can be maintained for the long term. Europe and the EU says, look, we are in it for the long haul. We're not going to abandon Ukraine. But certainly I think going into this winter, things could get a little bit more difficult trying to maintain that level of support ongoing.